Alright, so I just got back from the ironing board of just kind of giving this a good press along the outside edge and making sure that all of this is laying nice. I don't have any major ripples, or I don't have any weird pleats for where my fabric kind of gathered up into that seam, so that's a good sign. It's always good to kind of check yourself along each seam, or along this way here. So while you're sewing. So now what we need to do is we just need to attach our facing unit onto our bodice and collar combination unit here. So what we're going to do is we're going to, again, with right sides together, we're going to start with lining up this center front seam here. So along the center front line, we're just going to start with putting some pins along this front. And again, you're really going to have to work at manipulating the fabric to make sure that that seam line that you're sewing stays flat. And this is especially true around that neckline curve, because it is fairly tight. You know, we're working with small pieces, and you're going to be working with small pieces as you sew and construct. So it's good that we're practicing this now, so that when you do your full-scale projects, they will seem easier, because you're going to have more room to work with, and you'll already have sampled how to apply different facings and neckline procedures. So just know that we do this for a reason, so that when you get to that time when you're doing your full-scale projects, that this isn't the first time that you've seen it. So what we're first going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to kind of tackle this facing unit in two steps. So the first step that we're going to do is we're going to sew this center front seam line at 5/8 of an inch. And what you'll probably notice is that your collar is going to want to kind of, it's going to want to swing to the front. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that this collar is out of the way. So just kind of pull that center front collar area back and pin it, just so that we're not going to run over it with our presser foot. So we're going to be sewing this at 5/8 of an inch, and we know that it's going to be sewn at 5/8 because that's what's marked on our pattern here. So I'm just going to go ahead and I have my raw edges lined up here, and then I have some notches that indicate where that 5/8 inch marking is. And I just want to make sure that this raw edge that I have my pins along is laying flat. So I'm going to go ahead and do a back tack at the front and the back of this seam. So again, I'm just running that raw edge right along the 5/8 inch marking. All the way down this center front seam. And then as I get down to the end here, I'm just going to do a back tack there as well. And then lift up my presser foot and needle and trim those thread tails. Alright, now what I can do is, since I have this line in place, I can come back around and just start matching up my raw edges. And I'm going to take that pin out of my collar so that I can move that around as I need to. And I'm just going to match up these raw edges, keeping everything flat. Hopefully that when you get to that shoulder point, all of your shoulder seams, your shoulder seam of your bodice will hopefully line up fairly well with the shoulder seam of your facing. And so if you look at this from the top side, you can see that this seam line should match up. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually going to pin it a little bit farther down to try to keep that all running parallel to each other, or running, in line with each other. And then I can come back and try to just manipulate the bodice collar combo to meet up with my facing piece. And again, we're just matching up those raw edges. Want to make sure that we keep at least that 1/4 inch line from the raw edge. We want to keep that flat, because that's where our stitching is actually going to go into. Alright, and this is pretty thick here, and I'm just going to flip that over to see how things are laying on the back side. And as you can maybe see here, I had a little bit of things moving around and kind of folding down in there. So I want to make sure that everything's flat. So always give it a good look on the top side and on the underside for all your stitching, and don't be afraid to put some extra pins in to make sure everything's going to be held flat. Alright, things are looking pretty good there. And we got a lot of layers going on, so that when you go to stitch this around, just be aware that you're probably going to have to go slow when you actually stitch this down. So I'm going to match this up here on this back side. And see how my facing is kind of flipping up in the air? That's fine for now, because it will lay flat when we go to flip everything to the inside. But we just want to make sure that this edge, this raw edge right around the outside, that's where everything is laying as flat as possible. I'm just going to go ahead and put some pins in there. Really just try to manipulate that, and again flipping that over from the back side to the front side, making sure that everything is laying flat. Alright. It does usually take a little bit of extra finesse of just moving that fabric around to make sure that everything does lay flat. Alright, and what you might want to do is, like, because we have those seam allowances, you might want to just put an extra pin in there to make sure that they stay open while we do this stitching. So, alright, I have all my pins in place, and what I'm going to do is, I actually might stitch from the underside here, because I feel that that's where there's a little bit more bulk into the fabric. So then I can just kind of keep an eye on it to make sure that nothing that no pleats are created as I sew. So I'm going to stitch with the wrong side of my bodice facing me, and again, according to my my patterns, I'm going to be stitching at 1/4 inch all the way around. So make sure that you identify those 1/4 inch markings on your bobbin cover and follow that all the way around. So I'm going to be starting at that around at that center front area where we just did our straight row of stitching, and I'm going to do some back tacking at the front and back of that, and then as I sew around this edge, I'm just going to very slowly manipulate that fabric around the curve, pull out those pins where I can, and just make sure that I'm really keeping this fabric straight, and also keeping an eye on that 1/4 inch seam line, or that 1/4 inch guide line underneath of my presser foot along that bobbin cover. Alright, slow and steady. And if you find that you're, kind of struggling to keep everything lined up with that bobbin cover, what you might be able to do is even use your 1/8 of an inch stitch line as a guide, and just be about 1/8 of an inch from that. So, there's more than one way to do things a lot of times with sewing, or there's more than one way to, come across with a similar finished product. So, if you would prefer to use that stitch line, that's fine. And we're just going to do a quick back tack there. Oh, I probably should have stopped at the 5/8, but it'll be okay. Alright, and trim up those thread tails. Alright, now what we need to do is we need to come back in and we need to do some grading and some clipping, and then some understitching. So what I first want to do is, along this 5/8 of an inch at the front, I want to go ahead and take that down to about 1/2 an inch. So I'm taking about 1/8 of an inch off of the outside edge, and I'm trimming this. And again, trimming is when we take all layers of fabric down to the same width. Oh, and it looks like I maybe got off a little bit there when I was trimming. So we're going to trim both layers down, and then we're going to grade the facing side. So I'm going to come back on the facing piece only, so the piece that has the inner facing fused to it, and I'm just going to cut that down to about half the width at what it was. So I'm just going to kind of cut that down to about 1/8, and I'm going to go through the stitch line and go ahead and trim that off, and then pull that piece off and toss it aside. Then I'm going to come around the curved neckline area, and I'm going to grade that. It's already down to about 1/4 of an inch to start with, so we just want to take off the facing side, so the facing portion, I guess, and grade that down to about 1/8 of an inch. Just reducing some of that bulk. Alright. And then I want to come in and I want to clip and do some notching. So I'm clipping through all layers, clipping through that 1/8 of an inch stitch line that we put to hold the collar down to the bodice, and I'm clipping all the way to this 1/4 inch seam line that we just put in to put everything together. So I'm clipping down into that, and it's getting real thick right at this shoulder seam. So I'm going to come back and I'm going to notch out some fabric there, but I want to do my clipping first. Make sure that you don't accidentally grab the under part of the bodice. We're only clipping through those seam allowances. You don't want the your actual body of your garment to accidentally get a hole in it. So, alright, so I've done some clipping, as you can see, all the way around to keep that shape. And then what I want to do is I want to come back and just do some notches. So I'm taking triangles out of this seam allowance, and what that does is it reduces that bulk. So I'm just going to go ahead and clip out some notches all along here, especially on that shoulder seam area because it is so bulky. There are so many layers kind of meeting up there. And then I'm just going to go ahead and take a couple more notches out of the back as well as on the front, just to reduce the bulk, and so everything will lay a little bit nicer. Alright, I'm going to do one more, so take 3 out here, 2 out of the back, and just make sure that when you clip and notch that we're not accidentally snipping into any of the threads that you put in. Now what we're going to do is we need to do some understitching. And so if you want to, I would go ahead and suggest, it looks like, and what I'm noticing is that my my seam allowance is kind of giving me some troubles when I'm trying to get this to lay flat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back in and just clip into my seam allowance here and release that. And I'm going to do that on both sides. Maybe that's that might help too. Just get things to roll a little bit nicer. So what I did is I just went in and just clipped my seam allowance back towards where that shoulder seam was created. I'm going to do that on my bodice as well. Maybe that will just help relieve some tension. I'm just going to clip into that so that there's just a little bit more movement when I go to flip this around. Alright, now what I want to do is, again, I want to make sure that all of my seam allowances are pressed towards the actual facing piece. So I'm going to go over to the iron, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to press it flat as the seam was made. Then I'm going to open my garment up so that my collar and my bodice are on one side and my facing is on the other, and then I'm going to press my seam allowances towards the facing so that we can do a row of understitching from the top side. So I'm going to stop the video and do that press step, and then we'll come back and be finishing up here in a moment.